Hello, my name is Liz Heileman from HIVandHepatitis.com, and we're here with a distinguished panel to discuss some of the new research regarding hepatitis C presented at the Conference on Retroviruses and Opportunistic Infections this week in Boston. We have here Michael Sagg from the University of Alabama, and Daniel Fearer from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, Anita Coley from the Leidos Biomedical and National Institutes of Health, and finally Arthur Kim from Massachusetts General Hospital here in Boston. So let me start with you, Arthur. We had several studies that were presented on the first oral abstract session about new hepatitis C therapies coming down the pipeline. Can you give us a little summary of some of those?
Sure. Well, at this meeting, we're seeing a lot of work presented about viral hepatitis in general, but clearly the virus of the hour is hepatitis C. So the virus of the year, perhaps. And we are in a stage where new treatments are upon us and also imminent. And in this context, the CROI meeting has become a major venue for communication of key results that will inform our thinking of how we manage patients today. And so what we saw in the first oral session were several key studies. The first basically were triple therapy still using interferon. And then the last several showed the interferon-free era. And so we can divide those up and decide what we learn from each of those. I think from the first studies involving interferon, I think the major lessons are that these newer generation protease inhibitors are going to be better than our first generation protease inhibitors in terms of tolerability. And efficacy-wise, it's very clear that in co-infected patients that there is no loss of efficacy.
And this is an important result. With interferon, often people that were HIV and hepatitis co-infected would have lower response rates, but a lot of that seems to have
in the PEG-RIBA era, we saw differential response rates for persons with HIV. And since the DA era, we have yet to see a clear trial that shows that HIV people do any worse in terms of efficacy. So I'm very pleased to say that we don't have to worry about efficacy. Now, drug interactions is a different issue, but there are some complications. But at least we can tell our patients, you know what, you'll do at least as well as someone who's monoinfected with hepatitis C.
Excellent. And what are some of the kinds of response rates we're seeing? Usually we talk about sustained virological response, which in hepatitis C is essentially a cure, which is perhaps the biggest difference between HIV treatment, that a matter of months now and somebody can be cured for good.
Well, I think we can talk first about the interferon-containing regimens, which are, I would say, improvements, but not necessarily the improvements we're looking for in terms of reaching that 90% or the 100% thresholds. So that brings us to the real improvements, which occurred later in the session about the interferon-free regimens. And I think I'd like to turn to my colleagues.
Well, Anita had one of the most exciting studies presented about interferon-free therapy.
The most exciting.
The Synergies study, which showed that we can have some very promising results with some very short regimens. Do you want to give an overview of that?
Sure, Liz. So, the Synergies trial is a trial that's really been designed to evaluate short duration combination directly acting antiviral therapy. Studies have been done, as Arthur mentioned, looking at 12-week durations of interferon-free therapy, but really we wanted to push the bar to see if we use combination directly acting antivirals, what is that threshold of duration that we would really need to use to achieve SVR. So in this vein, the Synergy trial was developed. In the first arm, we used a combination therapy with sofosbuvir and ledipasvir for 12 weeks. In the second arm, we used a combination therapy again with sofosbuvir, ledipasvir, and added a non-nucleoside NS5B inhibitor, GS9669.
And let me just add, sofosbuvir is Gilead's drug that was just approved, and it goes under the brand name Sovaldi. So that's been available only a couple months now.
With the addition of this third directly acting antiviral, we shortened the duration of therapy to 6 weeks. We had an additional arm in which sofosbuvir, ledipasvir, and a protease inhibitor, GS9451, was used again for a shortened duration of therapy for 6 weeks. All patients were treatment naive, and the population enrolled in this study was one that we feel is really a good proportion of patients with advanced liver disease. So really historically our most difficult to treat patient population. SVR rates, SVR12 rates is what we reported yesterday. On the first arm with the 12-week regimen, the SVR rate was 100%. And on the two 6-week arms, the first using the sofosbuvir lodipisphere 9669. We had one relapse occurring prior to SVR4, but an overall SVR rate of 95%. Yes, and it was great. And then on the third 6-week arm, incorporating the protease inhibitor, SVR12 was 100%. The regimens were safe and well tolerated, and we had no discontinuations, no serious adverse events related to drugs, and we really find this promising. It's a short duration of therapy, and we feel it'll be very relevant globally in the treatment of hepatitis C.
And not even ribavirin.
Not even, correct, not even ribavirin. Really, we wanted a regimen that would be able to be broadly used, and ribavirin brings a lot of toxicity as well as teratogenicity. We feel it will be a problem treating hepatitis C globally.
Right, so without the ribavirin, you may be able to treat women who want to become pregnant or people who are prone to anemia, so that would be a big advance. So thinking of these studies collectively, what can we say about the future of hepatitis C treatment? Is interferon on its way out? What about the cost of these drugs and their availability? And how many doctors do we have? We have enough doctors out there to provide the treatment for everybody who needs it, or what do you think?
It's a lot of questions all rolled up into one. Now, I'd like to step up because we were just talking about this before, and my opinion is that I pretty much don't use interferon. It'd be very hard pressed to use interferon at this point for me. And we can have exceptions, and we've talked about what those are, but I will come out strongly to say that what we have even today will get most people through, whether they have HIV infection or not, and that I feel like I gave people awful side effects and really hurt enough people trying to cure them in these last decade where I'm done. And so I think I could segue from that saying that there are, of course, the FDA-approved regimen with sofosbuvir for 12 weeks and ribavirin. Nonetheless, the FDA-approved regimen for those not intolerant to interferon is 6 months of sofosbuvir, and I think that's an extremely viable regimen for most people awaiting the new drugs that we're going to see in
Okay, well, Mike
8 months.
recently was on a panel that put together a set of new guidelines for hepatitis C treatment, and they actually depart a bit from the FDA-approved label indications. Do you want to talk a little bit about what those guidelines
Sure.
say?
So what we did is the AASLD and the IDSA in collaboration with the ISUSA put together guidelines, and the thought was twofold. One is that the revolution is underway, that there's going to be therapies that are coming out so fast that it's almost going to be impossible to keep up with. And so we went at a set of guidelines that were a living document. And that's the second point, that unlike guidelines in the past where you print them and you put them into a journal, this is all web-based. And it's deliberately so because it can change monthly or weekly. Coming out of a conference like this where we see this information, I think that I would argue that in addition to interferon, I don't think I'm going to write for much ribavirin anymore. And the other point is that some of these studies are coming out, they don't have time to get the full FDA review, but as they get approved, mixing and matching drugs, if we believe them to be safe, we show the drugs' interaction side effect profiles, that a guideline can recommend an off-label use. It admits that that's what it is. But the way we approached this was to say, not telling somebody when to use the drugs, not when to treat. It's if somebody were calling one of us and said, or any one of us on this panel and said, I've got this patient with this and I think they should be treated now, what do you recommend? That's what the guidelines are addressing.
Right, I think you said when the guidelines came out that there's no way that a clinical trial can be done now, a phase 3 clinical trial for every possible combination in every possible patient population. So there's going to have to be some, I guess, educated guesswork.
Right. So Arthur, you were on and
Yeah. The guidelines, I hope, are useful to clinicians out there who are just getting into hepatitis C treatment. And I think we need to expand, as you mentioned, the number of people willing to treat hepatitis C. I was very heartened after the session at the beginning of our meeting, which was a case-based session that described some of these decision-making processes and the new regimens that are coming, that I overheard in the audience saying, well, you know what? In our clinic, our HIV clinic, we need to start doing this ourselves and not referring necessarily unless we get into trouble, because this is the way to bring the cascade of care that we lose patients along the way. If we don't know everyone who's infected, if we don't link them to care and get them a full discussion of the risks and benefits of treatment, don't get them treated, then you can get to 100%, but if you multiply all those fractions, you're not having as much impact on the epidemic as we could be. And so overhearing that type of discussion at this meeting, where providers are willing to overcome those barriers, study those barriers, and figure out how to apply these 95 to 100% efficacious treatments to patients. And then I guess the final main theme at the end of every talk seems to be cost.
Right.
The cost of the agents were not really taken into account in the guidelines. We decided, what would we do if we had a patient in front of us who had never had treatment before, or who had this genotype, or who had treatment before and had another genotype? We tried to give some guidance, but ultimately we're going to have to figure out how to pay for this all.
So right now we're looking at the two drugs that have been approved so far, which is Sovaldi, which I mentioned is about $84,000 for a 3-month course of treatment, and the other one is Simepravir, brand name Alicia, which is about $65,000. So the guidelines mention that these two drugs, there's been a study called Cosmos that shows they work very well together, but that's a lot of money.
I would point out, though, that the efficacy is so high that if you have a very high-risk patient who you really need to get that SVR, and it's been well demonstrated, including additional data at this meeting, how SVR helps patients avoid hepatic decompensation, that money could be money well spent compared to the former standard of care, telaprevir, boceprevir, which had a dismal rate for those patients. And then even sofosbuvir, ribavir, and interferon for your first 24 weeks, that's more expensive than 12 weeks of simepravir and sofosbuvir.
But I think all of us are hoping that maybe for the first time ever, when drugs are being released, that competition will actually have price as a consideration for which drugs might be selected. It's going to be a fascinating ride for the next 2 years as all these drugs come up. And you agree that you think that's going to happen?
I think it's very hard to tell. I would like to. Can try to influence that, and being sort of activists, as we talk to them. In the past, that hasn't helped us much. I would point out that is from our HIV standpoint. One of the beauties there, I want to get back to something Arthur said and tie this in here. As HIV-based folks, we are in this terrific position of having used these complicated drug-drug interactions. And let's point out, really, mostly did the studies outside the drug companies of combining different companies' medications.
Right.
They didn't do that themselves. So I'm a little perturbed, actually, by discussions being concerned somehow about off-label FDA use. As an infectious disease physicians, this is what we do. That is almost an economic decision by the company, what they decide to get approved for by the FDA. It costs a lot of money, and you get it approved for your best indications, and then you leave it to the people in academia in general, the ACTG as we did for HIV, to decide what the best combinations are. This is not up to the FDA, nor do they want this to be the case. Some insurance companies are trying to rely on that to avoid paying for things. That's a political decision. So I would come back to say that for HIV, we have done these studies ourselves for a long time, continue to do them, and then they eventually make it to guidelines. So I'm not so stuck on the FDA approval.
Right. But I think even the FDA, at least in the package inserts, the current approvals are saying for use in treatment and combination therapy for hepatitis C. They don't say only use with drug X or Y, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think, as Dave was saying, it is part of academia's responsibility to do these, early phase concept proving studies about how to use these new antivirals together. And as an ID community, that's the research initiative we're going to have to take on in designing these, short duration combination studies, even across drug companies as the medications become approved, or as companies are willing to work with academia and partner to do these important trials.
And a resource like HCV, it's hcvguidelines.org is the website. That's going to be able to bring a lot of these, instead of waiting till the next CROI or the next AASLD conference comes around, people are going to be able to see the results right away, we hope, and that should
And I can tell you the commitment from the panel members has been awesome. You ask for something in 24 hours, there's a revision, it's reviewed, and it can be posted. It's going to be very quick, very nimble.
I want to get back to something Arthur said, too, about the treating physicians. And we think we have, although not among HIV-infected people, I think we found most of the people who know they have HIV, we know their Hep C status, but we also know that 50-75% of people who have hepatitis C in general in this country don't know they have it. We have a huge number of people, and we're going to need more treaters. And I think that docs who are experienced in HIV treatment, again with combination retrovirals, are excellent candidates, and certainly people who are doing primary HIV care are absolutely qualified.
Absolutely.
One of the things that we need to recognize, and it's something that we should point out to our HIV doc colleagues, though, is the amount of liver disease that's occurred and to not miss that. And I think as HIV docs, we're kind of used to, a platelet count of 100,000 isn't that big a deal. We're lucky it's not 50,000 from their ITP. But that is actually a sign of portal hypertension with our patients. We do not want to miss cirrhosis, which is then the risk for significant risk for increased risk for hepatocellular carcinoma, and then really the people with portal hypertension may have varices and they need screening. So as we get into it as HIV docs, we have to learn from the liver docs and learn the important things to not miss cirrhosis and screen for hepatocellular carcinoma, and certainly not miss the ones who have portal hypertension. So if we're going to take this on ourselves and not refer, we absolutely have to do nominally ultrasounds. I think the position in the States is probably twice a year an ultrasound, a relatively insensitive test. Some of the payers have cut back, so in New York, even where we're wealthy, we can't get CAT scans anymore, which we used to do, and that hasn't been as proven. And if they have a low platelet count, they need to see a gastroenterologist.
Hopefully online. Hopefully online, Dr. Sherman's talk at the beginning of the meeting
That's really
will be present. And it taught a lot of the ID physicians how to manage, how to work up the liver disease.
Yeah.
And it may be something that we as ID docs were not too well trained on.
So that may be, to tie this all together, I think it's a very important take-home point, that anyone who understands HIV can pick up this HCV stuff pretty quickly because it's incredibly similar, except you can cure HCV. What we have to know is what are the risks and how to assess for end-stage liver disease and how to stage the fibrosis. Lots of ways to do that. And it's in Ken's talk among other places. And then managing the drug-drug interactions. But I think we're all going to find it exciting to be a part of this. It's a new revolution. It's like HIV on fast forward. What happened in the decade between 93 and 2003 for HIV is going to be happening between 2014 and 2016 for HCV, and it's going to be a pretty fun but wild ride.
Excellent. So on that note, sounds like we have a lot of excellent choices, some barriers, but a lot of patients are going to be in great shape. It sounds like people
Absolutely wonderful.
that were had few choices are now going to have many.
And we have to speak up as well for the marginalized who have
Yeah.
hepatitis C. And when I say that, that's a pretty broad category. The uninsured, the people in prison who may not have immediate access to these drugs due to cost, people in developing countries. There's a whole host of individuals who will have to work hard to get onto these 100%
In many ways,
effective
they're the
treatments.
populations that probably need treatment the most.
Right,
So.
and that's where I think all the advances in HIV care, delivering that care to marginalized individuals, we can learn lessons from that and apply it for the next decade.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you all for chatting with us, and thank you.